Thank you so much. I start by uh, giving all my thanks to Tom C, Colin Dietz, Crystal Amber, Javier Osorio, and all my colleagues and friends, Dan Martinez, Bill Simmons from the University of Arizona, and many other people that I might not be mentioning, but that invited me today and worked hard for us to have charlas de café, nice coffee, cookies, and they are taking care of us. So thank you so much for that. And I always feel at home at the University of Arizona. Thank you also for coming today and to be interested in what I'm going to present. I hope it will be of your interest, and it's part of a project, a research project that I started in 2017 when after my PhD, I know here we have PhD students, and when you finish your PhD thesis, you say, I now want to study something completely different. So my PhD research was in the US-Mexican border, and then I switched. And for the last 5 years, I have been doing research in the southern border of Mexico, in the city of Tapachula, the border with Guatemala. And as Javier introduced me, thank you for that introduction, I work more from the perspective of the bureaucracies of migration, particularly these street level bureaucrats, the ones that are the first respondents from the side of the state with the immigrants. And particularly, I work with a gender perspective. And my work is based mostly on detention centers. And in the last 2 or 3 years, things have been changing in Tapachula, and I would say in the whole country, since in 2019, the National Guard, that is the army, started to be in charge of checkpoints and immigration controls. So the next one, please. Some of the questions that I bring today to discuss with you is, first of all, why has Mexico consolidated the militarization of its borders in the last 5 years? Why should border verification and control not be in the hands of the armed forces? And the third one, what risks do migrants face when they are detained by the National Guard? So, the next one, please. Just as a context, it's very important to understand that in 2011, Mexico went through the most important constitutional reform, the constitutional reform of human rights. And that means that the Mexican state is obliged to prioritize and generate all its actions within the framework of the protection of human rights established both in the Constitution and in all the international treaties that Mexico has ratified. And as you know, because many of you study Mexico, Mexico is one of the countries that has signed and ratified the highest numbers of treaties. We always sign and ratified human rights treaties, but now, after the reform, after 12 years of the reform, we started to be very critical in my institute to create a research that is interdisciplinary to understand the effects of that reform. What, after 1 decade of having the reform of human rights, and in this case, I will present this big contradiction of having the constitutional reform, and at the same time to have the military, the armed forces, in charge of public security. And within public security, the migrants are one of the most vulnerable populations, because now the immigration controls are also in charge of of the military. The next one, please. Okay, so the process of militarization didn't start in 2019. It was maybe more evident, and it is a very important year because in 2019, the National Guard was created along with different legal frameworks that legally justify the action of the armed forces in public security. But it has been a process that started after 9/11. And we need to understand that the southern border of Mexico is very much, the infrastructure and how the border has changed is very much connected, of course, with US policies. And with that turning point, you are very young, and for you, 9/11 seems so far away. Most of you have lived with in the 9/11 era, but for the ones who come from the 20th century, we understand that the 9/11 was a turning point in terms of how the public agenda on migration changed, and migrants became officially threats to national security. So after 9/11, a whole process gradually started a process of militarization gradually started to take place in the southern border of Mexico, along with what you know best, the public discourse of migrants as threats to national security. It was in the previous administration with Enrique Peña Nieto that for the first time in the official report of national security of Mexico, migrants were focused as one of the main populations that are threats to national security. So what we're seeing now, and yesterday we were discussing this with Dan and Javier, the relationship between the enforcement of the border between US and Mexico, and particularly with the Trump era, how the detention and deportation in Mexico numbers started to go up. So now we are talking about, next one, arbitrary detention in Mexico. And there is this relationship between securitization and criminalization of migration and higher possibilities to be victim of a serious crime and of human rights violation. We know that along or together with the securitization, militarization of the borders, we have more migrants that are exposed to suffer serious human rights violations. So between 2016 and 2020, a total of almost 4,000 migrants report having been victims of crime in Mexican territory, especially robbery, extortion, smuggling, and crimes against liberty, such as kidnapping and illegal retention. Of course, this is not only a consequence of militarization, but has to do with also the context of organized crime and how they manage some of the traditional migration routes to travel along the country. The next one, please. So now we're talking, I always say we're in the paradigm of arbitrary detention. Almost, I mean, I don't dare to talk about numbers with my colleagues that do quantitative here, but a majority of migrants that enter the Mexican territory end up in detention. I mean, it's difficult to have the numbers, but what we know is that we are breaking historical records in numbers of detentions in Mexico, because detention has become like the principal way, or I might say the only way, to get to or not a regular status. So when migrants interact with authorities, they immediately get to a detention center, and in that detention center, the authority determines if these people can be asylum seekers or if they will be deported. But the important thing is that detention has become generalized, systematic, and it is against all principles of international protection. There is a very important observation for the ones that are interested in international law. In 2020, the Committee for the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families launched an observation, the observation number 5, that explains clearly what is arbitrary detention. And Mexico actually has all the characteristics of arbitrary detentions that are mandatory, automatic, systematic, generalized, regardless of the reasons for which people migrate. This is very much the same in the US. I mean, we have the main problem is that asylum seekers, they have to start their procedures while in detention, and this has serious consequences for human rights. What I will explain is what happens when the military or the armed forces are the ones who detain people before getting them to detention centers. The next one, please. So here is a map of the number of immigration detention centers in the country. Mexico is the country in Latin America with the highest numbers of immigration detention centers. I don't have, and it would be interesting to compare now with the US, but clearly, regionally, Mexico, and unfortunately, is a country that is detaining more migrants and has more facilities. This goes hand in hand with the investment, of course, with the US government and the US training. And we are, in some way, adopting the model of privatization of immigration detention centers. And you are experts in these topics, but we are seeing that, no? That we are actually adopting the US model with the implications for human rights. The next one, please. So as I said, I mean, why I started to study this, because As a feminist, as an activist in human rights, we are very worried when we see the cases of people that are by the law. I mean, the Mexican immigration law has a human rights approach, and supposedly it has the mechanisms to protect migrants, forced migrants, and people who arrive irregularly to the country. Getting to make the Mexican territory without papers is not a crime. It is an administrative fault. So it should be treated from the point of view of derecho administrativo or administrative law, and not as a crime, not as but the whole treatment is as if it was I don't know, derecho penal, uh, penal law. Okay. So what happens when a military is the one that is in charge of public security? There is an important movement in Mexico from the NGOs that are against and have been following this issue for the last 10 and 5 years of how little by little the armed forces have gained a very important role for public security in all countries. So what we have learned, and I conduct a lot of fieldwork. I usually every 2 or 3 months I am or in the border between Mexico and Guatemala or with the US. And we have seen cases of women from Central America that have been victims of serious human rights violations when they are detained by National Guard, mainly physical and sexual abuse. And within a framework of a punitive immigration policy, people don't dare to present charges or to report that they are victims of crimes, and more if the aggressor is a federal agent. No? So there is also this discussion that we can have from the point of view of punitive justice. No? What are the consequences or the non-intended consequences for vulnerable populations, just as Central American women in Mexico? The next one, please. Here is a report that was published last year. This report is Bajo la Bota, is a result of a research that was was conducted by more than 5 NGOs in Mexico. And it is a great report. It has very important information about not only the size of the National Guard, how it has grown in numbers, but also it has testimonies, for example, of racial profiling, xenophobia, and other practices that this National Guard is doing when they conduct when they are in charge of these checkpoints, especially because, as I said, they are not trained for that. The next one, please. So before going to the main point of the presentation, that is to reflect on the effects and how can it affects different elements of the migration process, I want first just to point out some very important moments to understand that this process of militarization has been growing little by little. It's like when we discuss deportation in the US, sometimes people thought it started with Trump, and no. The first wall was built with Clinton, so we need to understand Clinton administration, Bush, Obama in terms of infrastructure, and then to be to have the big picture of Trump. Here is the same. We cannot say it's Obrador who started the militarization. We have had this for the last 25 years. And I will say that the 90s is a very important decade to understand Chiapas and to understand the militarization of the southern border as a consequence of the uprising of the Zapatista movement. And the Mexican army significantly strengthened its presence on the border, and they started to build up different buildings and infrastructure in the southern border. Also, there is this Operation Sentinel that is just an immediate response after 9/11 to close the border and to bring military forces. And then clearly the Programa Frontera Sur in 2014, this is like the most comprehensive program that is made up to create uh, like to yeah to create smart borders and also to militarize the border in Mexico. And as I said, the consolidation is just the consequences of a series of events that started more than 30 years ago. The next one, please. So in 2021, we had almost 102,000 elements from the National Guard. And the problem is the federal police was completely changed, was institutionally eliminated, and was transformed into the National Guard. So there was this political um, game, or there was this a lot of contradictions, because at the beginning they said the federal police will become the National Guard, but that doesn't mean that they will be subordinated to the military. The National Guard will be a civil guard, but that never happened. From the beginning, many of the federal police were dismissed, and more people from the army were hired to create the National Guard. So there has been a lot of lack of transparency and accountability in data reported by the National Guard. Yesterday that we were discussing this with Javier and Dan, we don't really know the numbers. We have different reports. We don't know how many I would say soldiers or agents from the National Guard are being deployed in the borders, both the northern and the southern border of Mexico. But also, it's not only about numbers, but we don't know the mechanisms for internal control. There is lack of clarity on how they operate. There are no protocols to know how are they conducting the checkpoints, the verification of immigration status. The opposite would be the institute, well, not the opposite, but in contrast with the National Institute of Migration, if they comply with the law or not, that's another thing. But at least there is a law and there are norms that clearly establish how, when they should conduct these checkpoints, and there are protocols that they should use for these checkpoints. In the case of the National Guard, we don't have an idea of how are they actually collaborating with the National Institute of Migration and detaining people. But what we know is that, imagine, just in 2 years, they have accumulated more than 3,400 complaints, of which about 1,300 have been concluded. Only a very small percentage of these have been determined to be admissible. The problem with the military is that they have their own ways of internal control. They have their own ways to report and to solve their problems, to solve their claims. So there are not many possibilities from the, for example, National Commission of Human Rights. They present complaints, but in terms of citizenship, I think we are losing mechanisms to make them comply and to make them verify how are they operating in the field. The next one, please. But what we know, and there are many scholars, and I would say more NGOs and activists that are starting to study the National Guard and the military as their object of study, to understand the consequences of having them incorporated into social life. And 2 months ago, we had a very interesting conference at UNAM to discuss this, and former elements from the army came to this, and also one that is active. They came to the conference, and they were even themselves complaining. They said, we don't know why they are asking us now to be in charge of social policy in Mexico. No, they were the ones who were vaccinating with the COVID. They are building schools, they are building airports. I mean, now that the army in Mexico has become a key actor for many things, even for social policy. And 2 weeks ago, there was a big protest in Mexico City. It was the families of the army who came to the streets to say, we are meant to do something else. I mean, the army is not a core, is not a body that could be used to do everything that the president decides to do. We are trained to identify an enemy and to eradicate that enemy, not to do so many other things. This is interesting because we are starting to see even, how can I say, a feeling of that they are not comfortable with what they are being asked to do, and they are starting to be against what the president is asking them to do. Um, so, and I will, I'll try to go to and finish the presentation by saying that we are seeing that there is a pattern, and it's globally in the whole many of the Latin American countries, and Mexico is not an exemption, that when you get the military forces into social life, it is evident that these are bodies trained to confront and not to protect. So what we are seeing now is an increase in institutional violence, and what Cecilia Benjivar, she's a scholar from UCLA, she talks about legal violence, no? That type of violence that occurs when um, the law, the norms, and the work of these bureaucracies allow these non-visible practices, institutional daily practices of violence and of dehumanizing people, in this case, people that are in detention. The next one, please. What we are seeing now, this is not new. The INM also, when they conduct their checkpoints, I mean, for the last 15 years, there have been very interesting reports on how they do racial profiling, but this has worsened with the presence of the military. We know that the most vulnerable populations are indigenous populations, Black people coming from Honduras, from Haiti, indigenous from Guatemala, even indigenous in Mexico. They are very vulnerable in these checkpoints. There was a very important sentencia, I don't know the word in English, from the Supreme Court last year. And this is generalized for all the country. And it is a case of 3 indigenous people. They were minors at that moment. It's called Caso Querétaro. They were indigenous from Chiapas. They were Celtales. They were going to Sinaloa to work on the agriculture, and they were detained by the INM. The INM, the National Migration Institute, didn't believe they were Mexicans because they didn't speak Spanish. So they thought they were from Guatemala. They took them to an immigration station. One of them was tortured. And in that moment, the NGO got the case. They were released. They were not deported, although we have cases of people, indigenous Mexican people, that have been deported to Guatemala and to Honduras. These people were not deported. And it took 7 years to take the case in court. And finally, they declared, the court last year, that all immigration checkpoints that don't occur in the border, there is a difference between control fronterizo, that is border control, that is okay, but immigration controls, those are the immigration controls along the country, mainly in the highways, they are unconstitutional. And the court says it's unconstitutional because it is against the freedom of movement and the right of not being discriminated, that is in the first article of the Constitution. With this action of the Supreme Court is very important, because we say all people are vulnerable when they are in touch, or when they are when they interact with immigration agents, and now with National Guards. It's a very interesting case because they chose one case of Mexicans. So they couldn't say, no, this is because they are migrants. No, all people in Mexico, in a country that people have dark skin, in a country where people are so diverse, with 62 spoken languages, the protocol from the National Institute of Migration says that agents have the experience to identify who might or not be a migrant. And they say, the protocol says literally, the agents should ask questions that all Mexicans should be able to answer. And I say, I cannot think of one question that all Mexicans can answer. It's such a diverse country with different languages, not even the name of the president, right? So, legally, the norms also in some way promote this racial profiling. And we have interviews with former agents that say we recognize them by the color of their skin, by the way they smell. No? So clearly, that people that have dark skin, people that are indigenous, people that don't speak Spanish are very, very vulnerable when they are when they buy if they are able to buy a bus ticket and go all the way to the northern part of Mexico. So at the end, it can be a very intimidating experience, no? And we have cases that people even have their lives at risk when they are detained by the National Guard. The next one, please. Okay. So just I'm just okay. I'm just closing here, but um, yeah, I mean, this is something that the militarization of border controls, as I said, is something that is not new, but I think it's something that is accelerating other processes of institutional violence that we have been researching on. And I don't have much time now, but I would like to invite you also to think the connections between these processes and what we have seen in the case of US policy that also triggers, no, these types of actions from the Mexican government. And clearly it was the case of Donald Trump in May 2019, when, do you remember or not, but he sent a tweet saying, if Mexico does not stop migrants in its southern border, we are going to uh, increase tariffs by 5% of Mexican products in the US. The next day, the Mexican canciller, he was here, they negotiated, and 2 weeks after that, the National Guard was already with I don't know how many thousands of elements in the southern border of Mexico. So we need to understand these processes as a region, and how I wouldn't say that the policies in the states affects like in a sequence the Mexican policy. I say they are both interacting, and what we are seeing is the externalization of securitization and the acceleration of criminalization of migrants. And I think I stop here, and maybe we can have time for Q&A. Thank you.